Hi everyone, Last Epoch has been out for a little over a week now. I've been blasting the game quite a lot, so I've been going like 15 hours a day. I had a pretty good time, and I think it's a good time to make a review video. So I have prepared a few points here that I'm going to go through, the good, the bad, and stuff I want to see for the future. And to give you a bit of a perspective, here's my current Steam profile. So I have played the game in total around 240 hours. Most of that since launch last week. I had clocked in something like 50 hours or so maybe over the past 2 or 3 years. I've played it a little bit here and there to try it out, but ultimately it only really got on my radar right before launch when I started putting out all those guides and I started exploring the game a little bit. So pre-launch I had like 100 hours and then 140 or so since then. Most of that time was spent on this rogue here. So this is my hardcore falconer rogue. I leveled to almost level 101. I was the second in the world to reach level 100 on this character. And also currently, I think I'm still number 1 on the ranking here on in-game arena ranking. So I pushed pretty hard with this. I went to 666 corruption for the memes. I've done all of the dungeons on tier 4. I've grinded out some really insane gear on this character. So this was with Circle of Fortune. So I kind of went all the way with the progression here, just trying out the game, like trying out all of the end game. And I think I have a relatively good perspective. So this is kind of like the baseline here from what I have achieved and what I will be talking about and from what perspective. Now, for the good, there's a lot of really obvious things, I believe. Number one is the offline mode. It was just really nice because the servers were really unstable at the start. While this is actually an online character, you can just play offline. So if you decide to make an alt, if you decide to play alone, I think that's really nice to have in modern games. It's barely ever a thing from at least other ARPGs. So it's really cool that this exists, and it allowed a lot of people to actually play the game when the servers were down. So that's nice. What I also really like is that this game has built-in SSF, solo self found, or it's called solo character found. And there's also another solo mode called solo account found, where well, you can't trade, but your characters share one stash, but the other one is like character per character, basically. That is really cool. This is something that other ARPGs can definitely learn from. So I hope to see that basically in every single ARPG ever, because I think it's just so important and it's so crucial to ARPG experience. A lot of people just play solo, and being able to show off that you are playing solo and that you are doing everything on your own is very important, especially when it comes to rankings. Then the crafting. I think crafting is excellent in this game. It's probably the strongest point in Last Epoch. If you enjoy finding items and making items, this is absolutely superb. And they still have ways to improve this in this game. Like, it's very modular basically with how they have built it. They could make more runes, more glyphs, more kind of interesting stuff you can do with those items. So overall, I think just finding items on the ground and then modifying them further is definitely the strongest point in the entire game. It's just so much fun to try to make items. Now on the higher end, it gets a little bit too rough, I would say, but I'm going to go into that in a second. But in the grand scheme of things, the fact that basically every single piece of gear that you wear is in some way modified by you, and it's also a good mix of between deterministic and RNG. It just makes the whole gearing process, the whole progression really, really fun. So I think this is done very well on this game, and also something that other RPGs can learn from and maybe take some inspiration here. So I'm gonna be comparing this a bit to like PoE, D3 and D4, because those are the RPGs I've played for a few thousand hours each. And I don't know exactly about every single RPG out there, but I think out of all of these games, crafting is probably done the best in Last Epoch. PoE does have really interesting crafting, but it's kind of like too convoluted at this point, too high-end most of the time, like too much RNG. And in Last Epoch, there is, like a relatively clear way to get the gear that you want, basically. So this is kind of cool. And well, D3 and D4 basically just don't have any crafting whatsoever, besides a slot machine. We'll see how that changes in Season 4 in D4. So I guess we will get some crafting, and maybe it will resemble Last Epoch in some ways. but we can only speculate at this point. So in general, crafting is definitely powerful in this game and definitely one of the biggest reasons to play it. Then we have skill trees. So this is another really strong point here for Last Epoch. So not only does every class have quite a lot of skills, but they also all have their own skill trees. They look like this, and you can choose to spend certain amount of points in this and this. You can change skills completely. You can, you know, make an attack skill into a cooldown skill. You can change the element, you can change what it does, you can change the like, I don't know, the shape of the ability, or, you know, I can make this trap skill into a bow skill. There's a lot of really crazy stuff here. So that is really cool. I think they have done an excellent job. Now, of course, some choices are better than others, but ultimately, this is how you make builds. You make them around the skill trees, and then you kind of like put the rest together. And that makes it really exciting because there are so many different choices, so many different things that you're going to stumble over, and you're going to be like, man, I really want to try this at some point. So you know, you play one build and you always find the next build to play just by default, basically. So that is really cool. Very well done in this game. This also leads to the next point here, the build diversity. So it kind of goes with the skill trees. It just opens up so many different options. That is really well done, I think. So you're never ever gonna run out of builds to play. Like, even if you play this game like 12 hours every single day for the next half decade, I don't think you're gonna have to replay the same build twice. So that is really cool. And also, there's a lot of uniques that kind of play in that as well. There's a lot of uniques that are actually interesting, that, you know, completely transform a certain skill, you know, give you an interesting effect. So they have done a really good job there. I guess this also goes with the next points here of items. Also, what is really nice in items is that you have, you know, very interesting base types. So you have, like, you know, 10 different helms, you have 10 different body armors, you have 10 different pairs of boots, and they all have like their own, you know, implicit effects that you can see here at the top. For example, the top 3 stats, the armor, dex, and the melee and throwing damage for your falcon. And then, you know, there are other body armors for the rogue, for example, where maybe get a bunch of resist, you get a bunch of glancing glow chance, you get a bunch of whatever. And this also makes it really fun to kind of progress your character to higher levels and try to find not only the right stats or craft the right stats on your gear, but also trying to find the right bases. And in general, you're basically never gonna find like the perfect item. Like, the ceiling of how good an item can be is incredibly high, and you're never ever gonna get there. Maybe you're gonna find some crazy drop and, you know, make it like a crazy item. You know, something like this here is really, really strong, especially for SSF. Or something like this here, you know, these 4 legendary power items, for example. So there are some pretty crazy things you can find, but basically you never will. And that makes the item hunt very exciting, because you always know there is something out there that you can find that is, you know, even like a lot better than what you already have. So to give you a bit of a perspective, I consider my character pretty much done. In fact, I have not really gotten any upgrades whatsoever for like 50 hours of gameplay or something on this character, besides one drop. And I'm still very far away from best in slot gear. I could literally play this character another like 1,000 hours and I would still be quite far away from best in slot gear. So, you know, best in slot gear is like somewhere up here, and, you know, like the early game gear is somewhere down here, and I'm maybe here, you know. But I still consider my character pretty much done, because it's just so unlikely that I will find any upgrades at this point, which is also something I'm going to go into in a second again. But in the grand scheme of things, you can keep playing the same build basically forever, and there's still something you can hunt for. So that's kind of cool. Then we have the item stats. So it kind of goes with that as well. I think stats are done extremely well in this game as well. Like, it's really straightforward. You know, you have certain defensive stats, they are usually on the suffixes. You have certain offensive stats, they're usually on the prefixes, and they don't really mingle. Now, there are, you know, some cases, like for example, vitality is a prefix. It does kind of like a defensive stat. But in the grand scheme of things, you are kind of forced to have a certain amount of defense, and you also naturally gain a certain amount of offense as long as you have the right stats on your gear. So this is done pretty well. And also, it's pretty straightforward. You have 4 stats on your items, and then you have, you know, 2 prefixes, 2 suffixes, and you can, like, you know, kind of like target, okay, do you want to craft this, do you want to craft that, what do you go for? So this is done pretty well. And also the stats are very clear. So there's not really that many stats in the game, I think. And, you know, if you need a certain main stat to, you know, boost your main skill, then you're gonna stack that. And if you're a crit build, you're gonna stack some crit. If you need more mana, you're gonna stack mana regen. So there's like not really like that many like, you know, crazy stats in this game. They're relatively straightforward. But the interesting part, you know, as I mentioned, comes from like, for example, the skill tree, and there's maybe some uniques and some interesting effects that come out of that. So it's kind of a good combo of making the items themselves relatively simple and then having like the more complicated mechanics somewhere else. So that makes it really cool. Then we also have the faction system. So this is something I really enjoyed as well. So this is something that introduced in patch 1.0. I've played the Circle of Fortune to rank 10. I didn't do Merchant's Guild, but it also looks like something I really want to try. So if you want to trade, you can get some extremely high-end items in Merchant's Guild. So for like the high-end of blasters, Merchant's Guild is definitely OP. And for most people, I guess Circle of Fortune is just nice because you get more stuff. And you can also target farm your own thing. So it's kind of like nice that you have like this kind of like bad luck protection. Like you can play your character for like 50 hours and you have a bunch of stuff, but you might be missing this 1 or 2 pieces or so. Or you might want to really try to upgrade, you know, for example, my bow. I got this mainly through Circle of Fortune, like prophecies, for example. I went for unique bows, I went for exalted bows, I used Rune of Ascendance on them. And eventually I got a bunch of these free LP talents and I made this thing. So it kind of feels good because you can hunt down certain things or you can go and trade for certain things. So that is very well done. Then we have the loot filters. Loot filters are excellent in this game. They're very easy to use. Lately I made my loot filter tutorial, so if you need any kind of help, you can watch that. I also have a lot of other guide videos on Last Epoch, but in the grand scheme of things, even in like 1 or 2 minutes, you can already set up like a relatively basic filter for a build, and you can start blasting basically. And it's just gonna sort out a lot of the stuff that you don't want to see. It's gonna highlight certain things that you want to see and so on. And you can kind of like just like build on it step by step as you go to higher levels and you find more stuff. You can like, you know, make it stricter and, you know, just look exactly for what you want. So this is really nice because, you know, at this point I pick up like 1 item, you know, every 5 minutes or something like that. And, you know, I'm hunting for really high-end stuff. And it makes it really enjoyable to just blast through the game and not really have to worry about this loot on the ground. So this is really well done. There could be like some improvements here, like a few things are missing that I would like to filter for example, like the faction ranks or something like that, or, you know, some other, you know, like maybe the ranges of the exact stats that are present on the item or something. But in the grand scheme of things, it works really well. And also compared to, for example, PoE loot filters, you can actually filter the item itself with the stats on it. Like in PoE, for example, you can only really filter for the base item because items are unidentified there, and here they're all identified. So the loot filter can actually show you exactly the stats that you want to see on the item as well. So that is really cool. Another strong point here is Ingame Explanations. We have the game guide. You can just search for anything you want. It gives you an explanation of how stuff works. We have the tooltips. You can press Alt and Control. And there's even more information. So all of that is done really well. You see like the scaling tags on every single skill. So you can look at this here and you know exactly, okay, I need to stack fire damage, bow damage, dexterity, and then this skill becomes better. So that is all really well done, I believe. So there's nothing really too much like confusing here in this game. And there are some things that are not like perfectly explained. One example would be like the glyph of insight or something. So for that, sometimes you have to use an external resource, but it's like also kind of like high-end stuff. And that's kind of okay, I guess. But in the grand scheme of things, this is done really well. Another good point here is the infinite stash. Well, it's not exactly infinite, but ultimately it's practically infinite, basically. So you can have up to 200 stash tabs apparently, and they're all pretty large. And you buy them with gold. So it's very easy to get a lot of stash at least, and way more than you could ever need, as long as you're not like an absolute crazy hoarder. So that is really cool. And also we have infinite difficulty. So this is another cool thing about this game. We used to have that, for example, in Diablo 3 with Greater Rifts, but these days, you know, like for half a decade already, that is no longer a thing. Like difficulty is basically capped at Greater Rifts 150. The difficulty in Last Epoch is different from, for example, Diablo 3 difficulty. While in Diablo 3 you are always capped by your damage output, in Last Epoch you will always be capped by your survivability. You're not capped by your damage output. There's no timers when you do a run. You can fight anything for as long as you want. Now, obviously, that's not a good idea to be efficient if you fight something for like 5 minutes every single monster. But the point is that it's relatively easy to do enough damage, but it's not easy to survive. And you can always go higher, and you can always go to higher corruption and so on, and there will always be a challenge for you. So this is really cool. I think this is something that other games are lacking. Basically, every other ARPG doesn't have this. There's no difficulty where you will just get wrecked. But Last Epoch has it, and I think that's a really strong point. And that also goes with the next point, which is hardcore. I think hardcore, because of this infinite difficulty, is also extremely cool in this game, because you have a very clear path to just like ending your character. Basically, this is exactly what I've done. So I was just kind of like done with this build. I was moving on, rerolling another character, and I decided I just hadn't died at this point, even with like all the pushing and the tier 4 dungeons and everything I had done. I just didn't die, and I had to finish my character at some point. And well, there is one clear way to do that, and this is you go into the arena and you go until you die. The arena run will always end with your death unless you go out early, and in that case, you can finish a character by just killing it off. And this is something that other games are also lacking. Sometimes you just don't die. And I think it's kind of cool that you have this really clear, end to your hardcore progression in Last Epoch. Or instead of the arena, you can also just push your corruption higher and higher in the monoliths and also eventually just die. So that is really cool and makes hardcore very exciting. And in general, I think hardcore is relatively fair in this game. There is instant logout, there is instant TP. It's mostly like the PoE-esque hardcore, where it's about, one shot or get one shot kind of style. It's not like D4 gameplay where, it's like kind of like more attrition, more like, back and forth. So in terms of the gameplay, it's, not really as good as, for example, D4. But in terms of like the overall like difficulty, the overall fairness of hardcore, and and what I mentioned with like sending off your character to the death, I think that is really cool. And also in this game you can actually keep playing your character. So instead of actually losing a character, you see this is a dead character right now, it got sent to softcore. So yeah, I lose all of my mats and my gold and my stash and so on. But in the grand scheme of things, you keep your character around. So you can still do limit testing, you can still push to the limits, and you can still keep playing the character if you want. So for example, when I ripped, I just had a bunch of these keys in my inventory, and maybe I'll go back and do another arena run just to see how far I can get, or maybe I'll go back and do another few tier 4 dungeons just to practice those a little bit, and these kind of things. And of course, I should mention there are no cheat deaths in this game. So there is an item that gives you like kind of like a shield proc. I use this one here. But ultimately, I've been wearing it for like 70 hours and it never saved my life. I just died anyway when I'd actually died to this character. So I think that's also a really strong point for hardcore enjoyers. So no cheat deaths, also something that other games can learn from. And then we have the partial campaign skip. So that's my last good point here. You have to play part of the campaign. I think you have to do like Act 1 and Act 2 and then, I don't know, some other stuff. I haven't tried those campaign skips yet, but I know a lot of people enjoy campaign skips, and having the option to kind of like fast forward a little bit to the end game, go into the monoliths very early, especially with twink gear, when you are extremely powerful, you can make some insane twink gear in this game, and through legendary potential in particular. So that is kind of cool, so you don't always have to go through the campaign. But ultimately, if you're like, faster the campaign, you can do it in like 3 hours or faster, and it's not such a big deal anyway. But I kind of like that this exists. Now, let's talk about the bad stuff here. So I don't actually have that many points, but I do want to go into detail about them. Let's start with the combat. So I already mentioned this here, for example. I think that the combat, the flow of combat and, like what the enemies do, it's generally just not really on the same level as other games, in particular Diablo 4, I guess, and also I guess Diablo 3 has done this pretty well. So combat in Last Epoch is usually very short and usually very like one-shotty, basically, what I just described with hardcore as well. Usually it's just kind of like this, go around, one-shot most stuff or nearly one-shot most stuff. Now there are boss fights and they are basically mandatory and they are usually relatively long, so I think this is pretty well done. So for example, compared to Diablo 4 dungeons where you have like a boss at the end of every dungeon, here you do like 10 runs, 15 runs or something, and then you fight a boss. And this also allows the Last Epoch to actually have longer boss fights with a lot of mechanics. Whereas, you don't want to have like a 2-minute boss fight at the end of every 2-minute dungeon in Diablo 4, for example. So naturally, the bosses have to be really fast and, somewhat easy, I guess, in D4 for something like this to work. Or for example in D3 as well, right? If you do rifts, for example, or in PoE maps, like every single map has a boss and stuff like that. But in Last Epoch, you don't actually have bosses regularly. You only have them like once every so often. And this actually allows them to put a much bigger focus on bosses. So that is relatively good. But in the grand scheme of things, I think combat, monsters, this is definitely like some of the points that can really improve the most. It really doesn't hold a candle compared to Diablo 4 in my book. Diablo 4 just does this by far the best. And I think the only game that will rival this is PoE 2. So yeah, while it is fun in its own way to go around and, you know, like see your build flourish and, you know, you blast down entire screens of monsters and stuff like that. In the grand scheme of things, it is relatively shallow combat most of the time, let's say. So I hope that monsters is going to become a bit more interesting, and also this extremely, like, you know, fast-paced, like either you are alive or dead kind of combat could be tweaked in the future. But I guess with existing like healing and life leech mechanics and stuff like that in Last Epoch, this will be very hard to achieve. So this would probably need like a pretty major rework of combat and monsters, and also like, you know, certain character systems. Yeah, in the grand scheme of things, combat is all right, but definitely not one of the big strong points here in this game. So I'll give this a bad. So I would like to see more improvements in the future. Then we also have build balance. So while we have really great build diversity in this game, I think the balance is really bad in the grand scheme of things. Now every class has its own good builds, even every mastery, I guess. So there is definitely good stuff that you can make work. You know, it's not like you can't get through the game, and it's not like you're gonna get stuck somewhere. But in the grand scheme of things, some of these passive trees are just really outdated. Some of these skill trees are just really outdated. You can definitely see a pretty clear path towards power creep with the newly introduced masteries. For example, one example here is the Falconer, we have the Warlock. Both these just got added to the game, and both of them are like dominating the game right now. And also, for example, the Rune Master, that was the last one introduced before those two, is also one of the powerhouses in this game right now. So you can definitely very clearly see that the new stuff is generally really good, and the old stuff is generally somewhat bad. Now, you know, this is just a trend there. That's not always true. But in the grand scheme of things, there could be a lot more work put into build balance. I don't think that perfect build balance is really necessary. It's totally fine to also play like a weaker build and have fun with it. You know, I do that all the time in D3, in D4, in PoE, and I will do that in Last Epoch as well. But I think that there are definitely like some huge gaps here. So that could definitely be looked at. And also Ward. So I heard that Ward was already Omega nerfed, but it kind of sounds to me that endgame, basically everyone is going Ward anyway. There are people that run around with like literally 10 times the amount of Ward that I have as health. Like 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 Ward apparently is a thing, even more in groups. And yeah, that even makes it so that certain builds and certain classes that have no business of being a Ward build eventually just go Ward anyway, because there's extremely efficient Ward gain mechanics in the game. And it kind of sounds like you're just screwing yourself over by playing a live build. So I think, you know, live versus Ward versus, you know, also maybe other defensive mechanics, that needs to be in a better balance for this to, you know, kind of like feel fair and fun, especially on the higher end of things. So yeah, I think that should be looked at least. Then we have animations. I guess this also just like means like the general graphics. And I think the general graphics are relatively good. Right now I'm actually playing on, I think, just like medium graphics or something, and the game does look fairly good. Especially with the 1.0 updates. I think they've done a really good job here at making it better. And it did have its own set of issues like memory leaks and lags and stuff like that, but I guess that will be fixed. But in the grand scheme of things, the graphics are fine, I would say. Definitely something they can work on over time, but also the animations, I feel, is something that can really put a lot more work in. So, for example, you know, like the leap, like it was a Fury leap of the Primalist or something, like it doesn't feel nearly as satisfying and impactful to use as, for example, the Diablo 4 Barbarian leap. Now, of course, you know, very different studio, much smaller, etc. I kind of get it. But I really hope that over time you're going to get a better feel for all of the abilities. There's really just a bunch of clunky stuff. And if you compare this to like D3 or D4 gameplay, it just doesn't really hold up. And a lot more things can be done here with just like how it feels to play certain builds. But in the grand scheme of things, I guess they've done a relatively good job, and they have made improvements here. So we'll see where those go. Another bad point are the memory leaks here. So this is something I just mentioned. So basically with 1.0 upgrade, maybe before that, I don't know. But basically, at least for me, my FPS was constantly dropping to even below 20. So this might have to do with me streaming as well. But overall, I had really bad FPS, and every few hours I'd have to restart the game to actually like kind of play at all. And this is obviously extremely scary on hardcore. Sometimes my game would just freeze for like half a second or 1 second or so whenever I pick up loot or these kind of things. So a lot of optimization issues here. This is not true for everyone, but at least for me, this was a major problem so far. And I really hope that it's going to get fixed over time. I guess also because the servers were unstable, so every time I logged out to try to restart my game to fix the memory leaks, then, you know, I would sometimes end up in a queue again or something. So yeah, there's work to be done here for sure. So I'm just gonna leave that here. And also the brick wall and gear progression. So while I did talk a lot about, you know, how great the item system is and the crafting, I feel like, yeah, while there is always something to look forward to, at some point I felt like I was just like done with the character and I didn't really have any realistic path to any upgrades anymore. So I talked about this. I've played this character for like around 100 hours, and basically for like the last 50 hours, like half of its lifetime or so, I did not get a single upgrade on this character. So I kind of like, you know, early on, of course, in the campaign, you're gonna start finding all the time, and then you're gonna like, recycle items really quickly, and then you're gonna do like your crafting sessions once you're a monolith, and then maybe another one once you're in empowered monoliths, and then kind of like, you know, upgrade stuff as you go. But most of the time you always have to like switch multiple things around at the same time because of resistances, for example. So you can't really just like pick up an item, craft a bit on it and throw it on there, but usually save up a few things and then try to min-max it. But that is all fine. It's just that I think that once you have like an exalted item in every slot, it's very hard to even get anywhere beyond that most of the time. You see here that even though I've played this character so much, I still only have, you know, like a tier 6 exalted mod on this one. It is the right base, it has the right exalted stat, okay, but there is still a tier 4 mod on this, there's still no sealed mod on this. You know, it's not even like a legendary, like it could be like a 3 LP legendary or 4 LP legendary. I'm very far away from that. But in the grand scheme of things, it's just that it's so hard to find upgrades that are past a certain point anymore. Once you have decent exalted in every slot, it's so hard to even get anywhere where you have like a tier 7 mod or even double exalted. And I feel like it just becomes so exponentially more unlikely to find any upgrade that, yeah, as I said, you know, I've been playing for 50 hours without a single item drop until I got this thing here, which, you know, gave me like a little bit more health. I got like 5% more HP, but I lost a bit of damage. But ultimately, this was like the only upgrade I found in like, you know, the 50 hours before I actually went to go and rip this character. It was like right before the end I found this belt, for example. But yeah, it's just like kind of tough to continue gearing your character, at least in Circle of Fortune. With Merchant's Guild, of course, you know, people might find some insane items for your build that you can buy from them, and there's, you know, there's like a higher chance to keep going in the endgame progression. But I think that maybe high-end wise, at least Circle of Fortune, for example, could be buffed a little bit. There is really powerful stuff here, but in the end, the game just kind of like vomits loot at you, and, you know, 99.99% of it is just something that's gonna get filtered out at some point and that you don't care about. And then the other 0.01% that you actually pick up is going to be items that you know, brick on the first or the second craft attempt that you do. So you kind of just like pick up like, you know, 20 of these belts that have a good exalted stat, and then you know, immediately destroy almost all of them because you have to do like very risky gambles to even get an upgrade at some point. So I think there is a bit of like a middle step missing here where, you know, I've invested like 50 hours in this character and I still want to keep progressing, and I still want to, you know, maybe get like a double exalted item, or maybe have like, you know, a T7 mod on an item, or, you know, these kind of things. And yeah, something is kind of missing here before I go to like the absolute GG, like 4 LP legendary stuff or something like that. So that's just something maybe for the future for devs to consider as, you know, more gearing options. I don't know what they could do, but I'm sure they can come up with something. On the other hand, I gotta say that, you know, if you play a character for like 50-ish hours or so, you get it to level 100 and maybe a bit beyond that, then, well, your character is pretty much decked out with most of the stuff that you would like. And of course, you know, you can still upgrade it, but it kind of feels like also like, okay, your character is just somewhat complete with like the realistic upgrades you can get. So that is also not terrible, but I would kind of wish that there would be, you know, a few more steps somewhere in between where I don't feel like I'm just grinding for that, you know, 1 in a million drop basically. Now for the future, so this kind of like settles like the good and the bad points that exist. And here is like just some stuff that I would like to see. And also in no particular order. Let's start with the servers and the FPS issues. I guess this is kind of like a no-brainer here. So servers were terrible at the start. A lot of people were upset. It didn't really bother me too much, and I got somewhat lucky as well with how I was able to log in. But yeah, this needs to be fixed for next time. FPS issues need to be fixed as well. Like I had this memory leaks and all that stuff I explained. Sometimes I pick up loot and my game just lags for like 2 seconds, this kind of stuff. So that's very annoying. Definitely one of the things that was kind of bad, but it doesn't really take away from the game. I know this is fixable, and I know this doesn't have to do anything with like the design of the game. So it wasn't really a big point for me. Then we have the tooltip bugs. So another few things is like sometimes you have like an item on the ground, for example, and I would mouse over it and it would just not show the tooltip, or it would not show the level requirement, or sometimes you go to like the gamble vendor and it has like some really weird like large text when you look at items or something. So there is like kind of weird stuff here that exists, and I hope that this is gonna be fixed at some point. Speaking of tooltips, also, for example, minion builds don't seem to have any like damage tooltips, for example, so I'm not sure why, but maybe that could also be improved, for example, so you can actually see like how you can scale your minion skills. But yeah, also relatively minor, but I would like to see that improved. I would definitely like to see more content inside of Monoliths. So I didn't really talk too much about the endgame yet, but when it comes to content, yeah, we have the Monoliths, which are like the endgame basically, and then there's also like the like side content, I guess, the dungeons and the arena. They're kind of like more minor things, but the endgame content is the Monoliths, and they do get repetitive after a while. So I've done like, I don't know what, 2,000 or so echoes on this character, and yeah, it's basically always just kind of like, you know, you go in, you rush the objective, you're done. The bonus stability is somewhat irrelevant. You just try to fill it up a little bit as you go, I guess, but there's no incentive to full clear maps, like for example in PoE, where you have an investment into a map and you're gonna try to get as much out of it as possible, basically, by full clearing it. So that is kind of missing, I believe. And just in general, stuff to do. So there are these exiled mages, which is kind of nice, and we need more stuff like these exiled mages that you can maybe try to hunt down in those monoliths. Maybe there could be like, you know, other like meta progression paths as well, where there's like, you know, new special echoes they can do to get something, or these kind of things. And just inside a run, inside an individual echo, I feel like most of the time it's just like, you know, go to the end, ignore everything on the way kind of, and yeah, there needs to be more stuff. So I guess it's gonna come with more leagues or more cycles, and there's gonna be more content at some point, but yeah, they do get quite repetitive, and I can definitely see this being like a pretty major downside for a lot of people. If you look at the actual gameplay, outside of like, you know, item progression and crafting and, you know, this kind of stuff, it gets very repetitive very fast, and this is definitely one of the weak points of the game as well. Then I would also like to see more ladders. So we did have like the maximum leaderboard for example, the race to the 100. That was kind of cool, but I would like to see that actually in the game. Similar, I think, conquest type leaderboards like Diablo 3 could be really cool to have. It's also something I would like to see in other games. It doesn't really exist anywhere outside of D3, but for example, you know, the first 1,000 people to clear tier 4 this dungeon, or tier 4 that dungeon, or, you know, some other objective, you know, in the end game. Or, you know, there's gonna be like the pinnacle bosses in patch 1.1, so we need a ladder for that, you know, the first persons to clear like the new pinnacle bosses. Like that stuff is really hype. This stuff makes a new season start exciting, and people try to rush for that, and there's like, you know, a race to watch, and you have like official leaderboards. I think this is amazing. So I think that could be a really good addition here to the game. Then we have set items. So right now, I don't think I've ever seen anyone use a set item. I've never heard of anyone use a set item. I've never considered using a set item. So while all of the items are actually really cool, the uniques, the exalteds, the legendaries you can do and all that, set items are just completely pointless. I have a feeling maybe there is some stuff that exists that some people use, but I have not seen anything whatsoever. So I might be underestimating them, but in the grand scheme of things, I believe what the set items really lack is an upgrade path similar to legendary potential. I don't think that adding just legendary potential to set items is the way necessarily, because it would make them maybe too similar to uniques, but something, you know, something, you know, maybe they can do something there. So I think that is that would be nice. Then we have blessings. So this is definitely a big frustrating point, I think. Blessings is something that you farm from like the endgame timelines. You try to get like, you know, really good rolls of these, like especially stat blessings. And I think that it's fine how you have to grind them out. I think that's actually kind of fun. So even though I got very unlucky and I had to do this timeline like literally 30 times to get this 1% more critical strike avoidance that I needed, I think it's cool to farm out his blessings and then go to different timelines and you have like, you know, different monsters, different maps, different boss and so on. That's kind of nice. But whenever I find another item and I want to switch all of those blessings, I have to go back and farm that blessing again. And I think that feels really terrible. So there's already this interface here for the blessings, and I think it would be amazing if you could kind of like bank up those blessings, or like, you know, we can maybe, you know, save them for later use. Like, you know, okay, I already have this perfect blessing here and I would just like to maybe get the other blessings of the same timeline and then ready to go whenever I want to switch this. For example, on this timeline there's like one that gives you a lot of poison res, I think. So if I find an item that has insane amount of crit avoidance, but then I have to replace my poison res, and then I can, you know, just go and switch my blessing without actually going and farming this timeline again like 10 times to get that blessing, that would be amazing. So I think there could be some system introduced here where maybe you can save them up, or you can, you know, you unlock them and then you just switch between them whenever you want, or, you know, maybe unlock them and then you defeat the boss one time and it gives you just a choice of, you know, the 5 new blessings that you found, and you can choose any of your previously best roll blessings or something like that. Yeah. Then more loot filter options. So while the loot filter is already really powerful, I think if some stuff is missing, for example, I cannot filter by you know, the exact stat ranges. I cannot filter by the faction requirement, which is relatively important for Circle of Fortune players with the Rune of Ascendance. So there are some things like that. There's also like a few bugs with the loot filter. So I think, for example, I'm gonna show this right now. So if you make a copy of this one and for example, we select only certain bows here. So I have like, you know, only the top 2 bow types selected, for example. But if I change this to, let's say, spears, it will still show 2 selected here. Yeah, and it was just like, you know, select some random spears. And sometimes it also bugs out and actually shows that some things are selected that, you know, even though you have nothing checked. So some minor things like that. But yeah, there's definitely small improvements they can make on loot filter, but loot filters are so crucial to the experience and to the gameplay loop of the game that, yeah, making this as polished as possible is definitely a huge objective, I think. And lastly, for the future as well, there's a bunch of minor bugs with skills, you know, some skill nodes not working, some skills giving you too much or too little of what they say, these kind of things, and also monsters. Some of them seem kind of buggy with, like, for example, how they have like their hitboxes or some of their attack animations. They don't really seem to match up with, for example, they're doing. So there is some stuff like that. Nothing really major, I would say, but it does exist. And especially for hardcore enjoyers, this is relatively important that stuff works properly. So I just put this up here as the last point on the list. And that also sums up my entire review here that I have gathered. It's just all the points that I came up with for now. I will keep playing some Last Epoch. It's really fun, so I'm having a pretty good time, even though I talked a lot about, you know, some of the bad points here. I think that the game definitely has a pretty bright future. It had a really good start. Like the launch went incredibly well for them, so I'm quite glad to see that. We have, you know, more options, more ARPGs to play, and I'm just excited to see like where this will go from here on. So I think the Last Epoch hit just right for a lot of people, with, like, you know, being somewhere in the middle. As, like, you know, a game between PoE and Diablo 3 or Diablo 4 in terms of complexity, in terms of, you know, difficulty and all that. So they've done a really good job there, and I guess with more tweaks, with more updates, it will definitely continue to be a very good game to play, and I can definitely see myself coming back to this, you know, in the future cycles as well. We have to see exactly, you know, how I'll fit it in between D4 and PoE 2. There's obviously a lot of work to be done for a blaster, but yeah, in the grand scheme of things, Last Epoch is definitely up there for me as well. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed this review of mine, and let me know what you think. Maybe there are some points that I completely missed. Maybe you completely disagree with some points, or you agree with some things. So I'd be quite curious to read it in the comments. And otherwise, stay tuned for more Last Epoch content, and I'll see you guys next time.